top of the Alcazaba, the Red Castle of Mohammed V. It's over 700 years old, and it sits on a high plateau overlooking a flat plain at the foot of the mighty Sierra Nevada, the plain on which lies the Spanish city of Granada. Over there are the magnificent royal palaces of the Moorish kings. This entire area is famed throughout the world and is known as the Alhambra. Now, our interest in the Alhambra comes from the elaborate decorations which are found on the internal walls of the palaces. This is the beautiful Court of the Myrtles, with arcades leading off to the finest rooms of the palace. Visiting dignitaries used to pass through here and into the Hall of the Ambassadors. Throughout the Alhambra, every wall you look at presents a new and intricate pattern to the eye. Every ceiling is covered as well. This one has beautiful wooden carvings. Many of the patterns are of breathtaking complexity. Just imagine the task of building up this elaborate mosaic. We're now in the truly magnificent Court of the Lions, which is at the centre of another royal palace. Over there at the far end is the entrance to the King's Hall, where we shall find a great deal of interest to us. There are a dozen or more different patterns in the King's Hall. The carved plasterwork is particularly spectacular. So if you look all around the Alhambra, you're going to find a bewildering variety of patterns. There are hundreds of them. But are they indeed all different? Or are there ways in which we can classify these patterns into types so that we can appreciate the similarities between superficially different patterns? Well, let's make a start with this tiling pattern. This is a very simple pattern, of the sort you might find in your bathroom. It's an arrangement of different coloured square tiles fixed at an angle of 45 degrees. But to see what type of pattern it is, we'll ignore the colours and we'll just look at the outlines of the tiles. What we see is this simple square grid with one essential feature: repetition. The square outline repeats itself. In principle, we could extend the grid as far as we liked in any direction. This kind of repetition, where the pattern repeats itself at set intervals in two directions, is characteristic of almost all the patterns in the Alhambra. And this is the key which will allow us to distinguish various types of pattern. Here's another pattern. This one has a mixture of several different kinds of tile. We can build up a repeating grid from a square unit looking like this. Now this looks like a different pattern from the simple square grid we saw before. It seems much more complicated, but it will turn out to be the same type of pattern. And here's a third pattern. This is a plasterwork pattern built up by repeating a fairly complicated squarish unit. So will this turn out to be the same type of pattern as the other two? In fact, this is a different type of pattern from the others. You can appreciate the difference if you imagine what would happen if you took a mirror and reflected the patterns from left to right. Let's go back to this tiling pattern. We'll reflect it in a vertical mirror. This is what happens. The reflected copy looks exactly the same as the original. Now return to the plasterwork pattern. We'll try reflecting this pattern in a vertical mirror. Will the lines inside the square be in the same position after the reflection? No, they won't. You can still see some of the dark-coloured lines from the background. The reflected lines don't always cover them up, and so this time the reflected copy looks different. The same thing happens if we try a horizontal mirror. We might even put the mirror at one corner of the square and see if the reflected pattern matched a region outside the original square. But again, it doesn't. No matter where we place the mirror, we can't get the original pattern back again. It's rather like the difference between right-handed and left-handed patterns. So this is a different type of pattern from the tiling pattern we saw before. So two patterns can be of different types because one of them always looks different when you reflect it in a mirror. And the examples we've seen can be called square patterns and handed square patterns. Now, what other ways are there in which two patterns can differ? This tiling pattern can be found in two of the alcoves in the Court of the Myrtles. It's unusual in that many of the tiles have curved edges. And here's a plasterwork pattern from the King's Hall. This pattern doesn't have any curves, but there is a similarity with the pattern of curved tiles. Look at this region of the plasterwork pattern. Now take this point inside the region and rotate the pattern around that point. If we stop here, we'll have rotated a third of a complete turn, and the pattern matches itself. The dark lines in the background are exactly covered by the lines in the rotated region. We say that we can perform a rotation of order 3 about this point. Now let's look at the curved tiles. Once again, we look at a region of the pattern shaped like this. Take this point inside the region and rotate a third of a turn. As you can see, the pattern matches itself. Again, we say that we can perform a rotation of order 3. So that's something that these two patterns have in common. But can we say the same about the square pattern we saw before? If we rotate this pattern through a third of a turn about its centre, it certainly looks different. In fact, no matter which point we choose for our rotation, the pattern will never match itself after a third of a turn. With this pattern, we cannot perform a rotation of order 3. So what can we do with this pattern? Let's rotate it again about its centre. It does match itself, but after a quarter of a turn. In other words, we can perform a rotation of order 4 about this point. So the first two patterns can't be of the same type as the third one. But do these patterns have anything in common at all? Take this point in the square pattern. If we rotate a quarter of a turn about this point, the pattern looks similar, but it doesn't match exactly. To make the pattern match exactly, we have to rotate another quarter of a turn, making a half a turn in all. We can perform a rotation of order 2, but not one of order 4. Now let's do the same with this point in the other plasterwork pattern. If we rotate half a turn about this point, again the pattern matches. So, choosing different points for the center of rotation can give different effects. If we choose this point, we can rotate a third of a turn and get a match. But if we choose this point, we must rotate half a turn to get a match. But what happens if we choose this point instead? We only have to rotate a sixth of a turn about this point for the pattern to match. So if we choose this point, we can perform a rotation of order 6. Now suppose we look at 2 more tiling patterns in the same kind of way. Are we able to use rotations to say that they are different types of pattern? This pattern is in the Hall of the Ambassadors. If we choose this point, we can perform a rotation of order 4. Although the square is in a different position, the patterns match. And this is a pattern we saw earlier. If we choose this point, we can also perform a rotation of order 4. So are these 2 patterns of the same type? No, they're not. With this pattern, we found the rotation of order 4 about the center of a large octagon. But if we choose a point at the center of a small white square, we can find another rotation of order 4. With this pattern, we can perform rotations of order 4 about 2 essentially different points. But in this other pattern, we can't find a different rotation of order 4. Each such rotation is about the center of a 4-pointed star. And so, these 2 patterns must be of different types. So we've now found ways of distinguishing types of pattern by rotation. We can have rotations of order 2, 3, 4 or 6, which leave a pattern looking the same. But what about order 5? Now we've looked all over the Alhambra and we can't find a repeating pattern that looks the same 5 ways up. Is it possible this is something they missed? Well, we can't find anything that looks the same 7 ways up either. But just look now at this pattern. At first sight, this tiling pattern looks like we could rotate it through 1/8 of a turn and it would match itself. But now look at a larger region. If we rotate this region through 1/8 of a turn, it doesn't quite match. To see that, look at the part of the pattern we've marked in green. The rotated tile is larger than the green background tile. In fact, this pattern only looks the same 4 ways up. And that's not a coincidence. We'll never find a rotation of order 8 or 7 or 5 here or anywhere else. It's possible to prove mathematically that the only rotations we can find in a repeating pattern are the ones we've seen, with orders 2, 3, 4 or 6. Of course, We could have a pattern like this. This is a plasterwork design in the King's Hall. No matter how we rotate this one, it always looks different. And so this is yet another different type of pattern. The same is true of this carved pattern from the Hall of the Ambassadors. If we rotate it, it looks different. But could both these patterns be of the same type? Take the first one. If we reflect it in a mirror, it still looks the same. What about the second one? If we reflect this one in a mirror, look at the crossings. They seem to be the other way round. This second pattern is handed, so it can't be the same type as the first one. But there is something interesting we can do to this second pattern. Let's put a mirror here and reflect it. The pattern doesn't match. But then if we move it along, it does match. And so this second pattern looks the same after this more complicated movement, reflecting and then moving it along the line of reflection. We've now discovered various ways of distinguishing between different types of pattern, looking to see if you can reflect them or not, perhaps involving moving them along at the same time, looking for rotations of orders 2, 3, 4, or 6 about different points. Now, you can certainly have some combinations of these properties, but not all combinations are possible. You'll look in vain for any pattern which exhibits a rotation of order 3, say, about one point, and a rotation of order 4 about another. So, in fact, there turns out to be a limited number of different types of pattern. If we classify types by the operations that can be performed while still maintaining the appearance of the pattern, it's possible to show that there are just 17 different types of repeating pattern. And we've seen many of these types in the Alhambra. For instance, take this pattern we looked at before. We can perform a rotation of order 4 about this point, a rotation of order 2 about this point, and a reflection. So there are these 3 ways in which the pattern can match itself. This pattern is also in the Hall of the Ambassadors. We can find a rotation of order 4 about this point, a rotation of order 2 about this point, and a reflection. And so again, there are just the same 3 ways in which the pattern can match itself. In fact, these 2 patterns belong to the same type. It's one of the 17 types. Now, when we've been looking at the types of pattern created by the tilings here in the Alhambra, we've deliberately ignored the fact that most of the tiles are coloured. Now, of course, the colouring adds to the beauty of the decoration, and if you take it into account, it can modify the type of the pattern. But it can also produce another kind of effect. Just look now at the tiles in this small alcove. When you look at this design, you'll probably see the pattern made by the small black tiles. Each black tile is shaped like an aeroplane wing. But if you keep looking, you'll notice that the gaps, the white tiles, have exactly the same shape. Each white tile is also shaped like a wing. The white pattern is just like the black pattern. And if you're interested in modern art, you may have seen something like this before. This is part of a woodcut called Day and Night by the Dutch artist Moritz Escher. There's obviously a similarity to what we've just been looking at, but it's much more than that. Escher himself travelled to the Alhambra in 1936. It was his second visit, and he spent many days studying the patterns. A sketch from one of his notebooks shows how this idea of matching black and white patterns gave him a vision of interlocking birds. And 2 years later, he was able to use this idea to create the mirror image landscapes of day and night. Finally, let's come back to the idea of rotation to distinguish different types of pattern. Now, we weren't able to find a pattern that looked the same 5 ways up. But remember, we were concentrating on patterns that repeated themselves at definite intervals. Now, not all patterns do this. To see the sort of design we might be after, look at this pattern. It's built up from these 4 basic tiles. Now, this could be the pattern we want. If you rotate it 1/5 of a turn, it seems to match. It seems as though we can perform a rotation of order 5. But is this a design of the type we're considering? If it is, there should be a repetition. Let's see if we can find one. This very nearly matches the original area. But if we examine it closely, it's not quite the same. And as you go further afield, the rotation of order 5 no longer matches exactly. In fact, this is a pattern that doesn't repeat. It was discovered in the 1970s by the English mathematician Roger Penrose, and it's one of several non-repeating tiling patterns that can be found. So although there are regions where we can perform a rotation of order 5 on this pattern, we can't include it in our classification. Of course, the Alhambra has many more wonders than we've been able to show you. But even the little that we have seen has been able to teach us much of significance about the nature of geometric patterns.